The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 302, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched person after person approach Judge William Henderson's bench. She noticed how some people left the courtroom looking relieved, while others walked away with slumped shoulders and worried faces. Sarah checked her watch again, 10:45 a.m. She had a podcast recording scheduled for 2:00 p.m., plenty of time, she thought. But as the minutes ticked by and more cases were called before hers, she felt her anxiety growing. The courtroom was stuffy, filled with the nervous energy of others waiting for their turn. Officer James Parker, who had given her the speeding ticket 3 weeks ago, stood at attention near the judge's bench. His crisp blue uniform and straight posture made him look like a statue. Sarah remembered that rainy evening when he had pulled her over. She had been going 42 in a 35 zone, rushing to meet a guest speaker for her podcast who was only available during that time slot. The speed limit sign had been partially hidden behind overgrown branches, a detail she hoped would help her case. Case number 247, Sarah Mitchell, the court clerk called out, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Sarah stood up, smoothing down her navy blue blazer. She had dressed professionally, wearing her lucky pearl earrings that her grandmother had given her for graduation. As she walked toward the bench, her heels clicked softly against the floor, each step measured and confident despite her racing heart. Judge William Henderson barely looked up from his papers as she approached. He was a man in his early 60s, with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat low on his nose. His black robe seemed to make him blend into the dark wooden panels behind him. "Ms. Mitchell, you are charged with exceeding the speed limit in a residential zone. How do you plead?" Judge Henderson's voice was flat, uninterested, as if he had said these same words 1,000 times before. "Your Honor, I would like to explain the circumstances," Sarah began, her voice clear and respectful. The speed limit sign was partially obscured by the question. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson interrupted, looking at her for the first time with slightly narrowed eyes, "is how do you plead?" Sarah felt her chest tighten at his tone. She had watched him interact with other defendants all morning, and something felt different about how he was addressing her. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she replied firmly. Officer Parker stepped forward, presenting his evidence with practiced ease. "Your Honor, I clocked Ms. Mitchell's vehicle at 42 miles per hour in a clearly marked 35 zone. The radar gun was recently calibrated, and visibility was good despite the light rain." Sarah waited for her turn to speak, her mind racing with the points she wanted to make. When Judge Henderson finally nodded in her direction, she began explaining about the obscured sign and her clean driving record. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson cut in again, his voice carrying a hint of irritation, "the fact remains that you were speeding in a residential area. Your excuse about a hidden sign is just that, an excuse. This court takes traffic violations very seriously." Sarah noticed how different his tone was compared to his interaction with the young white man just before her, who had been caught going 45 in a school zone and walked away with just a warning. She kept her expression neutral, but her journalist's mind was already taking mental notes. "I hereby fine you $300, plus court costs," Judge Henderson declared, banging his gavel with what seemed like unnecessary force. "Next case." Sarah stood there for a moment, stunned by the severity of the fine. She had watched others receive much smaller fines for worse violations all morning. As she turned to leave, she caught Officer Parker's uncomfortable glance. He too seemed surprised by the judge's decision. Walking back through the courtroom, Sarah's mind was already shifting from frustrated defendant to investigative journalist. In her bag was her phone, containing the voice recorder she used for her podcast research. She had captured the entire proceeding, as was her right in a public courtroom. Little did Judge Henderson know, but his courtroom behavior today would soon reach far more ears than just those present in room 302. 2 hours after leaving the courthouse, Sarah sat in her recording studio, surrounded by state-of-the-art equipment. The room smelled of fresh coffee and the lavender air freshener she always used to create a calming atmosphere. Her on-air light glowed red as she adjusted her microphone, preparing for her daily podcast recording. The studio walls were covered with awards and framed magazine covers featuring her face. Truth and Justice with Sarah Mitchell had grown from a small weekly show recorded in her bedroom to one of the most influential podcasts in the country. Each episode reached millions of listeners, and her investigations had led to real changes in communities across America. Recording in 5, 4, 3, her producer, Marcus, counted down silently with his fingers through the glass window separating them. Sarah took a deep breath and put on her signature warm, confident voice that had become familiar to listeners worldwide. Welcome back to Truth and Justice, where we shine a light on the shadows of our justice system, she began, her voice smooth and professional, showing no signs of her earlier courtroom frustration. Today's episode was going to be about the Thompson case, but something happened this morning that I need to share with you all. As she spoke about her experience in traffic court, her phone buzzed quietly on the desk. Another notification from her social media team. They had just crossed 2.5 million subscribers. Sarah smiled, remembering how it all started 3 years ago after she lost her brother to police brutality. That tragedy had turned her from a local news reporter into a voice for change. Marcus gave her a thumbs up through the window. Her storytelling was perfect, as usual. She had a way of making listeners feel like they were right there with her, experiencing everything firsthand. But this isn't just about my traffic ticket, Sarah continued, pulling up statistics on her tablet. In the 2 hours since I left that courtroom, our research team has been busy. We've uncovered some disturbing patterns in Judge Henderson's ruling history. Her assistant, Jenny, slipped into the studio silently, placing a folder of printouts beside her. These were the preliminary findings. Cases from the next 3 days passed in a blur of activity as Sarah and her team dug deeper into Judge Henderson's court records. Their small office space had transformed into a makeshift investigation center, with papers covering every available surface. Empty coffee cups and takeout containers showed how many hours they had been working. Jenny, Sarah's assistant, walked into the office carrying another stack of court documents. "You need to see these," she said, placing them on Sarah's desk. "We found records going back 5 years. The pattern is even worse than we thought." Sarah picked up the first file, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. Her team had collected over 300 cases, and the numbers told a disturbing story. On average, black defendants were receiving fines 40% higher than white defendants for the same violations. In cases where judges had discretion, the disparity jumped to 60%. "Look at this case," Marcus said, pointing to his computer screen. He had been going through video recordings from the courthouse's public archive. Last month, a white college student was caught going 50 in a school zone. Judge Henderson gave him a warning and a $100 fine. But the same week, he fined a black mother $500 for going 45 in the same zone. Sarah stood up and walked to the large whiteboard they had mounted on the wall. It was covered. The day of the big podcast episode arrived. Sarah arrived at her studio early, while the morning sun was just beginning to peek through the city buildings. She had barely slept the night before, going over her notes one last time. This episode needed to be perfect. "We're going live in 30 minutes, Marcus called from the control room. Today was different from their usual recordings. They had decided to stream this episode live on multiple platforms. Already, over 100,000 people were waiting in the online viewing rooms. Sarah sat at her desk, arranging her documents in order. The studio lights cast a warm glow on the Truth and Justice logo behind her. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a sip of water, not from nervousness, but from the weight of responsibility she felt. 10 minutes, Jenny announced, bringing in the final guest. They had invited Professor James Wilson, an expert on judicial bias from Harvard Law School, to provide academic context to their findings. The professor sat down across from Sarah, adjusting his microphone. 5 minutes, Marcus counted down. Sarah could see the viewer count climbing rapidly. Local news vans had gathered outside their building, and hashtag Truth and Justice was already trending on social media. "Welcome to a special live episode of Truth and Justice," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "Today, we're going to talk about something that affects every one of us, the hidden biases in our justice system." For the next hour, Sarah methodically presented their findings. She played audio clips from various court sessions, showing the difference in Judge Henderson's tone when addressing different defendants. The professor explained how such subtle differences could indicate unconscious bias. "Let's look at the numbers," Sarah continued, sharing their research. In the past 5 years, black defendants in Judge Henderson's court paid an average of $420 more in fines than white defendants for the same offenses. But this isn't just about money. The studio phone started lighting up as listeners called in to share their own stories. A black business owner described losing his driver's license after being unable to pay a large fine. A white college student admitted getting only a warning for a similar offense. This isn't about attacking Judge Henderson, Sarah emphasized, her voice compassionate but firm. This is about understanding how bias works in our justice system. Sometimes, good people can make unfair decisions without realizing it. Professor Wilson shared studies showing similar patterns across the country. What makes this case special, he explained, is the clear documentation and data analysis your team has provided. Halfway through the episode, Sarah received a message that made her heart skip a beat. Judge Henderson's office had sent an email requesting a meeting. She shared this update live, earning surprised reactions from her co-hosts. The viewer count had now passed 500,000. News outlets were picking up the story, and social media was buzzing with discussions about judicial reform. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop vibrating with notifications. "Before we end today's episode," Sarah said, looking directly into the camera, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about revenge or public shaming. It's about awareness and change. Judge Henderson has done many good things for our community, but even good people can have blind spots." As they wrapped up the episode, Sarah felt both exhausted and energized. The professor shook her hand, complimenting her balanced approach to such a sensitive topic. Jenny brought in printouts of the initial social media response. The story was spreading faster than any of their previous episodes. "We did it right," Marcus said, giving Sarah a high five through the studio window. They had presented the facts without sensationalism, shown the pattern without personal attacks, and opened a dialogue about an important issue. Sarah gathered her papers, knowing this was just the beginning. Already, other podcasters and journalists were requesting interviews. Civil rights organizations wanted to use their research for broader studies. And somewhere in the courthouse, Judge Henderson was probably listening to the episode, learning about his own unconscious patterns for the first time. Sometimes, Sarah thought, remembering her grandmother's words, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of truth. She had no idea how right those words would prove to be in the coming days. The morning after the podcast aired, Sarah's story exploded across the internet. She sat in her home office, watching her computer screen in amazement as the view count passed 3 million. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. "Sarah, turn on Channel 5. Jenny's excited voice came through the phone. "They're talking about us on the morning news." Sarah grabbed her TV remote and switched to the news channel. There she was, her profile picture next to a headline that read, "Popular podcaster uncovers potential bias in local court." The news anchor was discussing her investigation with a panel of legal experts. "CNN is online too," Marcus called, his voice barely containing his excitement. "And Good Morning America wants you for tomorrow's show. This is getting huge, Sarah." Outside her apartment building, reporters had gathered with their cameras and microphones. Sarah peeked through her curtains, still in her morning robe, amazed at how quickly everything had changed. Just a week ago, she was just another person in traffic court. Now, she was at the center of a national conversation about justice and equality. Her laptop pinged with new email notifications. Civil rights groups from across the country were reaching out, sharing similar stories from their own communities. The hashtag Justice for All was trending nationwide, with people sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment in courts. "Sarah, look at this." Jenny had sent her a link to a social media post. A group of law students from the local university had started analyzing court records from other judges in the state. They were inspired by her investigation and wanted to help expand the research. The courthouse was now surrounded by peaceful protesters. Local news showed live footage of people holding signs with messages like "Equal Justice Under Law" and "Fair Trials for All." The crowd was diverse, people of all races and backgrounds standing together for change. Sarah's podcast website crashed twice that morning from too much traffic. The technical team worked frantically to move everything to bigger servers. The comments section was flooding with messages of support and more stories from people who had faced similar situations. "The governor just released a statement," Marcus texted. He attached a link to an official press release. The state government was announcing a review of judicial practices and sentencing patterns across all courts. Sarah's investigation had sparked something much bigger than she had expected. By lunchtime, national civil rights leaders were discussing her story on their platforms. Famous actors and musicians shared her podcast episode with their millions of followers. #Truth and Justice became the top trending topic worldwide. Sarah finally got dressed and made herself some coffee. Her small apartment felt too quiet compared to the storm of attention outside. She thought about Judge Henderson, wondering how he was handling all this attention. Her goal had never been to destroy his career, only to bring awareness to an important issue. "We need you at the studio," Jenny said during their 10th phone call of the day. "Major networks want to do live interviews, and we should respond while the story is hot." As Sarah got ready to leave, she received an unexpected email. It was from Officer Parker, the policeman who had given her the ticket. He wanted to share his own observations about patterns he had noticed in the court. His support could add another important perspective to the story. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt surreal. Just yesterday, she was a respected but relatively unknown podcaster. Today, she was becoming the face of a movement for judicial reform. The responsibility felt heavy on her shoulders. "Ready for this?" Marcus asked as he picked her up in the company car. They would need to use the back entrance of the studio to avoid the crowd of reporters. Sarah nodded, clutching her folder of evidence and research. "Ready or not, this is bigger than me now," she said, watching the city pass by through the car window. Sometimes the truth just needs one small moment to break through. Little did she know, the biggest surprise was still to come. In his chambers, Judge Henderson was about to make a decision that would change everything. Judge William Henderson sat alone in his chambers, staring at his computer screen. The blinds were drawn, keeping out both the morning sun and the crowd of protesters still gathered outside the courthouse. On his desk, next to a cold cup of coffee, lay printouts of Sarah's research. "Your Honor," his clerk, Michael, knocked softly before entering. "I thought you should know. I've been following Ms. Mitchell's podcast for months. She's one of the most respected voices in judicial reporting." The judge nodded slowly, running his hand through his gray hair. He had been up all night, listening to old recordings of his court sessions. The evidence was undeniable. There was a clear pattern in his rulings that he had never noticed before. "Play it again," he said quietly. Michael pulled up the video compilation Sarah had created, showing dozens of cases side by side. The difference in how he spoke to defendants of different races was subtle but clear. His tone, his patience level, his willingness to listen to explanations, it all varied in ways he had never realized. 23 years on the bench, Judge Henderson muttered, looking at the award plaques on his wall. "How did I not see it?" He picked up another report, a statistical analysis showing the average fine amounts broken down by race. The numbers didn't lie. Outside his office, the courthouse was unusually quiet. Many cases had been rescheduled due to the protests. Through his window, he could hear the faint chants for justice and equality. These weren't angry mobs, as some had predicted, but citizens asking for fair treatment. His phone rang, another call from the Judicial Review Board. They wanted a statement, an explanation, something to calm the growing storm. But Judge Henderson wasn't ready to make excuses. For the first time in his career, he was seeing his own actions through new eyes. "Michael," he called to his clerk, "get me everything you can about implicit bias in the justice system, and find out how I can contact Ms. Mitchell's team." As Michael hurried out, Judge Henderson opened his personal files. He began reviewing cases from the past month, this time paying attention to details he had missed before. The patterns Sarah had uncovered weren't just statistics, they were real people whose lives had been affected by his unconscious biases. His daughter called around lunchtime. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, worried about the news coverage. "We know you're not a bad person. You taught us about fairness and justice." "I did," he replied, thinking about the family discussions they'd had around the dinner table. "But sometimes we don't see our own blind spots until someone holds up a mirror." Late in the afternoon, Michael returned with more documents. "Sir, I found something interesting," he said, placing a folder on the desk. "Other judges across the country have gone through similar revelations. Some have become leading voices for reform." Judge Henderson picked up the folder, reading about judges who had recognized their biases and worked to change them. One had started a training program. Another had written guidelines for fair sentencing. They hadn't let shame or defensiveness stop them from making things right. "Get me Judge Thompson on the phone," he said suddenly. Thompson was the chief judge of their district, a respected voice in the legal community. "And draft an email to Sarah Mitchell's team. It's time we had a real conversation about this." As the sun set outside his window, Judge Henderson began writing. Not a defense or an excuse, but a genuine acknowledgement of what Sarah's investigation had revealed. He wrote about his background, his beliefs in justice, and how he had failed to see his own biases. "Sometimes," he wrote, "the hardest truth to face is the one about ourselves." He looked at Sarah's picture on his computer screen, the woman he had fined unfairly just a week ago. She had turned that moment of injustice into an opportunity for change. Michael knocked again. "Judge Thompson is on line 1, he said. "And Ms. Mitchell's team just replied to our email. They're willing to meet." Judge Henderson straightened his tie and picked up the phone. It was time to stop hiding behind his robe and face the truth about his actions. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest act of justice is admitting when you've been wrong. The conference room on the 15th floor of the Atlanta Justice Center felt tense with anticipation. Sarah arrived early, accompanied by Marcus and her legal advisor. The wall-length windows offered a view of the city skyline, where the morning sun was just beginning to reflect off the glass buildings. "He's here," Jenny texted from the lobby. Sarah smoothed her blazer and took a deep breath. This wasn't just another interview. This was the moment that could change everything. Judge Henderson entered the room wearing a regular business suit instead of his judicial robe. Without the elevated bench and formal courtroom setting, he looked more human, more approachable. His clerk, Michael, followed with a thick folder of documents. "Miss Mitchell," the judge said, extending his hand. His voice was different from that day in court, softer, more humble. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Sarah shook his hand, noticing how different this interaction felt from their first meeting. The conference room had been chosen as neutral ground, away from both the courthouse and her studio. A local mediator sat at the end of the table, there to help guide the conversation. "I've spent the past week listening to your podcast episodes," Judge Henderson began, settling into his chair. "Not just the one about me, but your other investigations too. Your work is eye-opening." Sarah watched as he pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten notes. She could see her podcast episodes listed with dates and timestamps, sections underlined, questions written in the margins. He had done his homework. "I brought something to show you," the judge continued, opening his folder. Inside were printouts of his cases from the past 5 years. "I've been reviewing every decision, every fine, every interaction. The patterns you found, they're real." The mediator nodded encouragingly as Judge Henderson shared his own analysis. He had gone beyond Sarah's investigation, digging deeper into his past rulings. The evidence of unconscious bias was even clearer than what her team had found. "The hardest part," he said, his voice growing quiet, "was showing these numbers to my family. My daughter is a civil rights attorney in Chicago. She's been fighting against systemic bias for years, and here I was, part of the problem." Sarah opened her laptop, sharing some of the thousands of messages she'd received since her podcast aired. People from across the country had written about similar experiences in their local courts. This was bigger than just one judge or one courtroom. "I have a proposal," Judge Henderson said, straightening in his chair. "I want to work with you on creating a training program, not just for our courthouse, but for judges everywhere. We need to learn how to recognize and correct our unconscious biases." The room grew quiet as he shared his vision. He wanted to use his experience as a case study to help other judges understand how bias can affect their decisions without them realizing it. He had already spoken with the Judicial Review Board, and they were interested. "This isn't about making excuses," he emphasized, looking directly at Sarah. "It's about making changes, real, lasting changes." Sarah thought about all the people who had shared their stories with her. The single mother who lost her job because she couldn't pay a fine, the young man who missed college registration because of an unfair ruling. This could be a chance to prevent those stories from repeating. "I have one condition," Sarah said, opening another file on her laptop. "We need to include voices from the community, people who have experienced bias firsthand. Their stories need to be part of this training. Judge Henderson nodded without hesitation. Absolutely. We can't solve this problem without hearing from the people it affects most. As they began discussing details, Sarah noticed the sun had fully risen, flooding the room with warm light. Outside, the city was waking up, unaware that in this conference room, an unlikely partnership was forming that would help reshape the justice system. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the biggest changes start with two people willing to listen to each other. She looked at Judge Henderson, who was earnestly taking notes as Marcus explained their ideas for the training program. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. 6 months after their first meeting, Sarah stood at the podium in the main courthouse auditorium. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, and community members from across the country. Behind her, a large screen showed the title of their new program, Justice for All, Recognizing and Addressing Unconscious Bias. When I walked into traffic court that day, Sarah began, looking out at the eager faces. I never imagined it would lead to this moment. In the front row, Judge Henderson nodded encouragingly. He was no longer just the judge who had fined her unfairly. He had become a partner in creating real change. Their training program had already been adopted by 23 court systems across 6 states. The results were promising. Early data showed a significant reduction in sentencing disparities where the program had been implemented. Change doesn't happen overnight, Judge Henderson said when it was his turn to speak. But it does happen when we're brave enough to face uncomfortable truths. He shared graphs showing how his own sentencing patterns had changed since completing the training. In the audience, many familiar faces watched proudly. Officer Parker, who had given Sarah the original ticket, was now part of the police training team. Michael, the judge's clerk, had helped develop a system for tracking and analyzing court decisions to identify potential bias. Sarah's podcast had grown even more popular, but now it wasn't just about exposing problems. It was about sharing solutions. Every week, she featured stories of courts and judges who were working to make the system fairer for everyone. "Look at this," Jenny whispered, showing Sarah her tablet during a break. The governor had just signed a new law requiring bias training for all judges in the state. It was being called the Mitchell-Henderson Act, a name that still felt surreal to Sarah. The changes weren't just happening in courtrooms. Local police departments had started their own training programs. Law schools were updating their curricula to include courses on unconscious bias. Even private companies were reaching out to learn from their experience. "Remember this?" Judge Henderson asked later, holding up a copy of Sarah's original traffic ticket. They both laughed. It seemed so small now compared to everything that had followed. The fine had long since been dismissed, but its impact had rippled far beyond that courtroom. Back in her studio that evening, Sarah recorded a special episode of Truth and Justice. This time, she wasn't alone. Judge Henderson sat across from her, both of them sharing their journey with millions of listeners. "The most powerful moment," the judge admitted on air, "was when I stopped being defensive and started listening. Sometimes the best thing we can do is admit we have more to learn." Their story had been featured in national newspapers and magazines. Harvard Law School was using it as a case study, but for Sarah, the most meaningful changes were the small ones. The thank you notes from people who had received fairer treatment in court, the judges who reached out privately to admit their own biases and ask for help. As they wrapped up the podcast episode, Sarah's phone lit up with a message. Another courthouse in California wanted to adopt their program. The movement was growing, spreading across the country like ripples in a pond. "We're just getting started," Sarah told her listeners in the closing segment. "Real change takes time, but it starts with each of us being willing to look in the mirror and face what we see." Outside the studio, the city lights twinkled in the evening sky. Sarah thought about that morning in traffic court, how angry and frustrated she had felt. That moment could have ended with just another unfair fine, just another story of bias in the system. Instead, it had become something more, a catalyst for change, a bridge between different perspectives, a reminder that justice works best when everyone works together to make it better. "Ready for tomorrow?" Judge Henderson asked as they left the studio. They had another training session scheduled, this time for a group of new judges just starting their careers. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the people whose lives would be touched by these changes. "Always ready," she said. "Sometimes the best endings are really just new beginnings."